Ahoy hoy! Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, or time-appropriate greeting depending on when you are watching this video or where you are located, but thank you for joining me. I am your host of this YouTube series, The Kevin Chandler, and you are watching The Stories Behind UFC 220, which I am super excited for and is going down this Saturday, which fortunately it tells me on the screen is January 20th, live on pay-per-view. So we're going to do something a little bit different with this video today. So we're going to try a little bit of a different format. Feel free to let me know what you think. We're going to start with the main event of the evening and then actually work our way backwards. I guess I should probably do that when you're watching it. Like start with the main event of the evening and then work our way backwards to the earlier fights so that if people are only interested in the main event or co-main event of the evening, you can get that right off the kind of start of the video. And then if you're interested in the rest of the fights, you can continue watching for those. So to kick us right off into it, UFC 220, as you already know or don't and should, is headlined by Stipe Miocic and Francis Ngannou. And we are going to find out if Stipe Miocic is still the baddest man on the planet. And I feel the need to make that distinction because I feel like a lot of people are saying, like, we're going to find out who the baddest man on the planet is. And like, yo, check yourself. We already know that. And it's Stipe Miocic. He has proven it already. 2 different times, well, multiple times in the UFC, but now 2 times as a champion, he is the guy. So I feel like when there's people being like, oh, who's going to be, and it's like trying to almost give too much credit to Francis Ngannou, we're going to find out if Francis Ngannou can take that on Saturday. But I just want to be clear that that title of the baddest man on the planet is already held by one Stipe Miocic. And one of the reasons for that is I'm a Stipe Miocic fan, is the reason I need to make that distinction, rather. I've been a Stipe Miocic fan for a long time. So we're actually going to start with the story behind Stipe Miocic and the champion, because the story behind him really is longevity and continued improvement of skills. So when Stipe Miocic really first came into the UFC, I believe he even first started wearing checkered shorts representing his Croatian heritage, which was awesome. I'm like an 8th Croatian, loved Cro Cop kind of coming up. So it was like immediate, attraction to Stipe Miocic, and like an interesting name, fun to watch kind of. And he was developing. So he came in as a Golden Gloves boxer already, so had clean hands, but I would argue it was seemingly having difficulty putting it all together, was doing it well, but not great, but then over the course of time turned from doing it well to doing it good to doing it great to doing it like a champion and championship level, and then has basically kind of continued that through his career. So he worked his way up the heavyweight division, worked his way into a title fight, won that title fight in devastating fashion, and since then has knocked out all challengers to come. Additionally, something that's fun about Stipe Miocic, he's still an active firefighter, which is like really, really cool as the baddest man on the planet in the UFC heavyweight champion. So he is going to be fighting, on the other hand, Francis Ngannou. And Francis Ngannou is really interesting, particularly because of the stark difference in Stipe Miocic. As I mentioned, Stipe Miocic has been in the UFC for a while, and we've been watching his skills improve for a while. Francis Ngannou, on the other hand, to the best of my knowledge, has only been training MMA for like 4 or 5 years. Like, he's really still fresh, new into the sport, into kind of learning. And so we've only seen a handful, not even a handful, of his fights in the UFC. And he's looked really good and looked really impressive, but like still really early. Do we know if there's a cap? Do we know if it's going to, when it's going to cap, or what? He's still a giant question mark is basically the thing. And so he hits really, really hard, but everyone hits really, really hard in the UFC heavyweight division. That being said, not everyone turns people into Pez dispensers like he did with Alistair Overeem in his last fight. So Francis has a big hype train behind him, and justifiably so, because he looks like different than we've seen from other prospects. This power that he has and the natural ability he seems to have with taking on the techniques of mixed martial arts, we're going to find out if he has learned enough already to be able to dethrone the baddest man in the world in Stipe Miocic. Another important note to show you how difficult the UFC heavyweight division is, Stipe Miocic currently is tied for the all-time heavyweight UFC title defenses in history at 2. Like, that's that's the record, is 2. So if he wins this at 3, he'll have more title defenses than any other UFC heavyweight in the history of the UFC. So UFC, heavyweight division, everybody hits hard. So Stipe Miocic hits really hard. I don't think that's unlikely that Stipe Miocic knocks out Francis Ngannou, but It's not unlikely that Francis Ngannou, or it's not improbable. I don't know. Francis Ngannou definitely can knock out Stipe Miocic as well. So regardless, we're going to find out on Saturday. And what we're going to find out is if Stipe Miocic is still the baddest man on the planet, or if Francis Ngannou took that title from him with maybe a devastating uppercut or highlight reel picture from Esther Lin afterwards. Before that, we are going to get us into some Daniel Cormier versus Volkan Ozdemir. Now, this fight is really interesting. Well, all these fights are really interesting to me, but the reason why this fight is really interesting is really styles make fights. Similarly to why Miocic versus Ngannou is going to be really interesting is because styles make fights, and most likely that's going to be a heavyweight striking expose, and it's just going to be amazing. And then this, on the other hand, why styles make fights for this is Volkan Ozdemir, very few people knew of prior to last year. Prior to last year, he wasn't in the UFC. He came into the UFC last year and then basically went on a tear and just started knocking guys out in, it's weird to say, but almost hilarious fashion. He hits guys in what Reddit MMA likes to almost call like a boop, because he hits guys and it doesn't look like he hits them that hard. Like, he hits them and it almost looks like it's like, ah, and you're like, ah, but then the guys are dead. Like, the guys look like they got hit with like a fucking wrecking ball, like really like devastating. And so, and he's done it time after time after time. It's not like a fluke thing. It's not like it's happened one time. And so he has now worked his way into a possible championship fight, or not a possible, he is in a championship fight against Daniel Cormier, and we still don't know a ton about his overall game because his fights are super short because he just boops dudes and they fall over dead. And so can he boop Daniel Cormier? We don't know. But to counter that, Daniel Cormier is, oh man, what do you say about Daniel Cormier? We first found out about Daniel Cormier when he burst onto the scene in the Strikeforce Heavyweight Grand Prix tournament. This is basically the last big heavyweight tournament style. Shout out to Bellator with one coming up, which is going to be awesome. But so this was the last one. And so you'll notice this is a light heavyweight title fight. Daniel Cormier first came out of the scene as a heavyweight in Strikeforce. He was an alternate in the tournament, ended up getting a spot, getting a shot, and then winning the whole tournament and won like the championship belt as a heavyweight, beating some really impressive storied legends of the sport, like not an easy road kind of thing. Then made his way over to the UFC and dropped down to light heavyweight, particularly because, well, he's not a huge dude, and his friend Cain Velasquez and training partner and bromance whatever was fighting at heavyweight, so he didn't want to fight at heavyweight, dropped down to 205, and then just started wrecking people. Worked his way up to fight John Jones, who was the champion at that time, and ended up falling short. John Jones, I mean, quite frankly, outgrinded Daniel, embraced the grind Cormier, which was unfortunate. Then John Jones happened to John Jones. He ended up, not being a part of the UFC or relinquishing or having to, give up his belt. And Daniel Cormier ended up fighting for the championship, winning the championship, defending that championship, looking good. John Jones ends up kind of coming back, ends up coming, well, he kind of come back one time. Then he eventually really does come back. And when he does, ends up beating Daniel Cormier again. And you're like, God damn. And then right after that, pops for steroids and has to give up his belt again. And you're like, God damn. And so Daniel Cormier is the champ again. And so he's openly talked about it, that he doesn't feel like he's the champion right now. He's not walking around parading the belt out, bringing it out to interviews, but he feels like he's kind of fighting for the vacant title, similar to when he fought Anthony Johnson. So I think he still has that kind of, fire, if you will, which is different sometimes than champions that are just defending their belts. So the style matchup that I was talking about is Daniel Cormier is an Olympic wrestler. I mean, went to the Olympics multiple times, 2 times if I remember right. It was a national wrestling champion, I think like 3 times. I mean, is a really, really good wrestler. So this is that styles, make fights thing, because it's basically a striker versus grappler. Can Volkan Ozdemir boop Daniel Cormier, or can Daniel Cormier turn Volkan Ozdemir upside down, which he does in just about all of his fights, and slam him on his head and or back? And so, I don't know. You don't know. We're going to find out on Saturday. And before we find out what happens with that, we're going to find out what happens with Calvin Guitar and Shane Burgos. Now, is it Burgos? I think it's Burgos. I'm not sure. Shit. I'm sorry, Shane. So regardless, there's a couple stories behind this fight. We're going to start with Calvin Guitar because I had to look him up again. I'm like, not again. This is the first time I'm looking him up. But just like the last set of fights, I had to look up Jessica Rose Clark, I remembered your name. You looked good. I liked it. I had to look up Jessica Rose Clark. This time I had to look up Calvin Kattar, and I'm like, man, do I not know these fighters as well as I thought I did? No, this is just his second fight in the UFC, and we've got this guy, the third fight on like the pay-per-view with Stipe Miocic and Daniel Cormier. Like, talk about an opportunity. This is clearly a spotlight and an opportunity for Calvin Kattar to do something, and he's got a stiff test in Shane Burgos. The reason I really know Shane Burgos is because he unfortunately has beat the shit out of a couple of guys that I really liked, and I was like fans of and looking forward to seeing what they could do, and then Shane Burgos just put a stop to it, and so I was like, all right, well, I guess I'm gonna be a fan of this guy now. So he's looked really good and really impressively good. So it's interesting to see that he has this matchup, and both guys have a huge opportunity here to make a name for themselves and really garner a lot of fans and, you know, acclaim for a really solid performance. So can Calvin Kattar show us what he has and make a name for himself, or can Shane Burgos put another kibosh on a quick little prospect and, you know, impressively show us or remind us kind of who he is, the Hurricane? Before that, we're going to watch Gian Villante and Francimir Barrasso. Now, I am embarrassed on two aspects on this one, because A, I'm embarrassed that again I have to look up who Francimir Barrasso was, and I'm like, shit, really? Like 2 on 1 card? Wow. And then B, then I was extra embarrassed because then when I looked him up, the guy's had like 8 fights in the UFC, and I'm like, you've had 8 fights in the UFC and I don't know who you are? And then I was like tertiarily, sure that's a word, embarrassed because I'm like, you've had 8 fights in the UFC and I still had to look you up? Like, I don't know who you are? Like, you've been that unimpressive in 8 fights in the UFC that you don't even really look familiar. So partially on me, partially on you. Let's see if he can change that on Saturday, Francimir Barrasso. So the opportunity to change that is against Gian Villante. And so to be fair, it's not like Francimir Barrasso's just been destroying guys and has 8 win streaks or whatever. He's been up and down. All of his wins by decisions, many of his losses by decisions, or, you know, being stopped or, you know, or finished. But so can he show something and, you know, keep us excited or interested or impressed? I don't know. But he's going to fight Gian Villante, and Gian Villante is very difficult to be a fan of, because Gian Villante is one of those guys that he looks really good when he wins and he looks really bad when he loses, basically. Like, when he loses and he loses bad and you're like, how, like, why? Man, really, John? Like, I feel like you're better than that. And then he wins and you're like, yes, that's what I thought you can do. And so he just lost, and we're going to see if he can show us if he again has that, if he has that, you know, flash of brilliance. So we're going to find out on Saturday if he can. This might be another fight that it might be a loser leaves town match as well. I think both guys are coming off of losses. It might be 2 losses for both of them. So if neither guy can be impressive, one guy's going to win regardless. But if the guy that loses might be on his way out, unless it's a fight of the night, crazy, really exciting thing. So before that, we are going to be treated with just sheer violence in Thomas Almeida versus Rob Font. This fight I am very excited about. I definitely didn't need to look up either of the guys in this. And as you see, both guys ranked in the UFC's top 20. But the real story behind this fight is violence and who can rise out of that. Both guys are really good, really technical, really aggressive, but not necessarily overly so they leave themselves really exposed. I mean, sometimes, yeah, but not necessarily known for it per se. So Rob Font has really good hands, solid wrestling as well, and has that kind of killer instinct that when he sees guys that are, you know, on the way out or looking for a way out, he'll give it to him, take that, and is a good finisher, you could say. Thomas Almeida, on the other hand, I feel like he's one of those guys you want to say is a really well-rounded striker. And what I mean by that is his Muay Thai is really good, but his boxing's really good. His clinch work is really good, even like with his Muay Thai. But so he's just really good everywhere on its feet, on the feet. So boxing, kicking, knees, elbows, spinning, everything he just looks really good at. And this might have some wrestling or clinch work or cage work, but most likely this is going to be a stand-up, pure slugfest of technique, though. So I guess not slugfest. This is probably going to be, you know, another like Jack Slack will probably be excited about this fight or what's going to happen during it or after it, as we all should. So the story behind it again is really excitement, violence. They are using this fight to kick off the card for a reason. This is going to help, invigorate the crowd, get everybody kind of ready to go, and hopefully get the other fighters, ready to go and put on good performances as well. So that is our fight, our set of cards for this Saturday, UFC 220, happening, Saturday, January 20th on pay-per-view. Only can technically watch it via UFC.tv or via YouTube or via many other pirated. God, there's something in my eye. There's other things that you could do if you want, but up to each their own. So I'm going to be watching it. Definitely. Are you going to be watching it? Speaking of watching it, as always, I sincerely appreciate you watching me. I appreciate you watching me right now. I appreciate it if you hit the subscribe button. I appreciate it if you watch any other videos. I appreciate it if you watch any videos in the future. Thank you, and good night. Bye.